So let's dive in and revisit strings. So you can use any character within a string. It doesn't have to just be a letter, but whatever you use will be part of the string. So if I take a number like 1, 2, 3, and I wrap this in quote marks, then now this is also a string. It's important to remember when you use numbers in a string that you are then working with the string data type, not the number data type. So any calculations you try to perform might come with some unexpected surprises, and it's not something you want to do too often. What the addition operator does with numbers is called the concatenation operator when you are working with strings. So if I try to add a value to my string, you can see it gets joined onto the string, as opposed to incrementing any value. The concatenation operator is useful if you have two separate strings that you want to join together. So let's create a string with the name Polly. Now let's create a second string for a last name with the text Abbott. So now, if I wanted to join these two strings together, so we had both the first and last name in the same string, we could use the concatenation operator. Let's give this a go. We get a single string returned containing the first name and the last name. JavaScript has what's called a set of standard built-in objects. We'll visit objects later, but they are essentially a data structure. These extend the capabilities of the language to help us work with it. So there's a date object for working with dates, a math object for deeper mathematical calculations. There's also a string object. Each of these standard built-in objects has a set of built-in properties and methods. A method is essentially some built-in functionality which allows us to perform some process or action. You can think of this a bit like when you follow a recipe to cook some food, or when you follow some directions to get somewhere. One of the properties of the string object is called the length property. When we use this on the end of a string, then the length of the string is returned to us. So let's start by creating a three-letter word called cat. Now, if we use the length property, we can see the length of the string is 3. If we take a slightly longer string, let's say hello world, we can see now the length is 11. So white space is counted within the length of the string, but the quote marks are not, and the length of the string starts counting from 1, unlike with the indices of the string. Sometimes when you're working with strings, you may find you want to find a certain character of the string. To find a certain character within a string, we can use what's called bracket notation. This is represented by 2 square brackets. As I mentioned, JavaScript uses zero-based indexing, which means the first character of the string will be found at the index of 0. So using this approach, we can find the character at any specified index within a string. We're going to create what's called a variable to store a string. We'll visit variables shortly, but for now, just think of this as a container for some data. So we'll create a variable called name and store the string Polly inside of this variable. Now, if we wanted to find the first letter of this string, we can use the variable name, followed by an opening square bracket, 0, because we want the first letter, and then a closing square bracket. We get P returned, because this is the element of the string which is stored at the index of 0. By using bracket notation, we can access the last element of the string. Instead of having to count through every character within the string to find the index of the last element, we can use a shortcut. We can pass in the length of the string into the brackets and then deduct 1 from that value. Remember that strings are 0 indexed. This approach can be used to find any other character within the string, starting counting from the back of the string. So let's give this a go with our string Polly. So we use the variable name, which is name, and then a square bracket. Next, we say name.length minus 1. And then we use a closing square bracket. This time we get Y returned, because this is the last letter of the string. So now let's go ahead and look at some methods we can use with our strings. JavaScript offers many different methods we can use with our strings, but I'm just going to introduce you to a few of these. We're going to start with one called toUpperCase. This method will convert all the characters in the string to uppercase characters. When you are working with methods, they'll return some sort of value, and this can differ depending on the method. For the toUpperCase method, the return value is the string with the uppercase characters. So let's try this with our name variable. So we'll say name, then we use a dot, and then we say toUpperCase. Lastly, and this is really important, because we're using a method, we need to use a set of parentheses. We get the string returned with the letters in uppercase. Let's recall the name variable. Nothing has changed. In JavaScript, strings are immutable. This means that once the string has been created, anything that we try to do to the string directly will not change the initial value of that string. It's a bit like saying you can't change your date of birth once you've been born. So if we wanted to save our changes, we either need to create a new variable to save the changes or update the variable to save the changes. So let's try this again. We'll create a new variable called updatedName. And we'll assign to this the name variable with the toUpperCase method. Now, I recall the name variable. I get the original string. Next, let's recall the updated name variable. We get our new string with the letters in uppercase. The next method to look at is called toLowerCase. This method will convert all the uppercase text characters within a string to be in lowercase. We won't save anything this time, but let's just try out this method on our updated name variable. So we'll say the variable name, which is updated name, then a dot, and then use the toLowerCase method. Lastly, we need our set of parentheses. We get the string returned with all the letters in lowercase. The next method we'll look at is called replace. The replace method extracts a section from a string and replaces it with a new value. The replace method takes two parameters. The first parameter is the value within the string you want to replace. The second parameter is the value that you want to replace the first value with. The replace method only replaces the first instance of a value, so it won't affect any reoccurring instances of the value. The return value of the method is the updated string with the replaced value. So let's try out this method by attempting to change Polly's name to Wally. We'll use the name variable for this. So I say name, followed by a dot, and then the method, which is replace. For the first parameter, I'll use P, and for the second parameter, W. When this runs, I get Wally returned. The last method we're going to look at with strings is called indexOf. The indexOf method lets us find the position of a specific character within the string. Inside the parameters, we pass in the character we want to find the index of. If the character exists within the string, we'll get the index of where that character is. If multiple instances of that character exist, we get the index of the first instance. If it does not exist, then we'll get -1 returned. Let's start by looking for the letter O. So we say name, followed by a dot, followed by the method name, which is indexOf, and then we pass in O. We get 1 returned because this is the index of the letter O. Now let's try this for L. We have 2 instances of the letter L. Now let's look for the letter Z. We get -1 returned this time. The letter Z doesn't exist within our string. Now we have explored strings some more, let's move on to looking at variables. So variables provide us with a way to store values. This is really important so we can make our code have some functionality, instead of just using the console. Variables allow us to label and store our data, and then access and use the data, or update the data at a later time. A good way to think of a variable is as a container. So imagine you're moving house, and you have a box with your clothes in. You'd likely write a label on that box, so that when it came to unpacking, you knew what was inside the box. So in code, you could create a variable called box1, and then assign to this the string clothes. JavaScript has 3 ways to create a variable. The first 2 are using the keywords let or const. Let and const were introduced in ES 2015, which is also referred to as ES6. This was a version of JavaScript published in 2015. Prior to this, the only way to create a variable was using the keyword var, so you may still see code which uses this, and that's totally okay, but going forward it's best to stick with using let or const. The main difference between using let or const is that variables created with the const keyword cannot be changed once they've been created. There are some naming conventions which are important to know when it comes to naming variables. The variable name should start with a letter, an underscore, or a $sign. Usually though, it's best to start the variable with a letter, and use something called camel casing. So what's camel casing? Well, camel casing is where the first word is all in lowercase, and any additional words capitalize the first letter, but the rest of the word is in lowercase. You can't use spaces in a variable name, which is another reason why camel casing is a good convention. Variables are also case sensitive, so uppercasing a variable and then naming it again in lowercase would actually create 2 separate variables. So let's have a go at creating a variable for our box of clothes. We'll do this using const. So in the console we use const, and then the variable name, which is box1. Next we use the equals sign, and then we go ahead and assign a value to the variable. For our variable, this will be the string clothes. Now let's recall the box1 variable. we get clothes returned. So one of the common tasks you may want to do is to update the variable with a new value. Remember earlier I discussed that when you're using methods with strings, you need to save the changes. Well, this is an example of updating a variable. So let's try updating our box1 variable, instead to contain some red clothes. We get an error. Earlier, I said that variables created with const cannot be changed. When you're using const, you need to be sure that you're not later going to need to change the value of the variable. So const is great for constant values, such as dates or numbers, but it's not good if we want to update a value. When we want to update the value of a variable, we need to make sure we use let to create that variable. So let's give this a go. We'll declare a variable called box2, and we'll assign to this the string clothes. Now, we'll go ahead and try to update this variable to red clothes. We don't get an error this time because we used let. Now we can recall our box2 variable. It was successfully updated and returns red clothes. In the next section of the video, we'll move on and start looking at data structures such as arrays.